What if love wasn't salvation, but the most subtle invitation to ruin? What if, in the very moment we surrender ourselves to someone, we also open the doors to a fate we were never meant to understand? There are questions that echo like voices down old corridors, reverberating against walls that have seen too much. There are gazes that burn not with fire, but with the memory of what's been lost. And there are loves that ask for no permission, they simply happen, like a slow fever that consumes everything, leaving behind a silence that cannot be erased. They say some hearts are destined to find each other, even if one of them is already condemned. They also say there are places where time does not flow in the same way, where every step awakens sleeping memories, and every shadow holds a name. I never believed in such tales, until the day he appeared. The man everyone said was dangerous. But what is danger, really? Is it the sound of a door closing behind us, sealing off a path with no return? Is it the delicious vertigo of coming too close to something we know might destroy us? Or is it simply the truth bare, inevitable that to love is always to risk? There are nights when I still hear the rain falling on the roof of that forgotten house, and I feel the same chill I felt when I saw him for the first time. There was something in him that defied logic, a strange mixture of pain and calm, of menace and tenderness, as if fate itself had shaped that man from the ashes of an ancient tragedy. And perhaps it had shaped me as well, just to make us collide. I discovered that love doesn't arrive with flowers, but with omens. It announces itself in the stillness before a storm, in the hesitation of a touch, in the held breath of someone who senses the abyss. And by the time I realized it, it was already too late to turn back. I loved him, and to love that man was like walking barefoot over shards of glass, knowing that each step could make me bleed. What if everything we lived was nothing more than an ancient cycle, repeated countless times under different faces and names? What if every encounter was only the continuation of a broken promise, made in another life? The mind resists, but the heart remembers. It always remembers. That was how it all began, a foggy morning when the world seemed suspended between the real and the imaginary. I had come to that small village seeking peace, but found only echoes. People spoke softly, as if there were secrets dissolved in the air. And at the center of it all stood a house, the old stone mansion, covered in ivy and shadows. The kind of place where time seems to have stopped to guard a story no one dared to tell. They said the man who lived there never aged, that he was rarely seen, and when he was, he carried with him the scent of wet earth and the gaze of someone haunted by ghosts. Some called him cursed, others, a murderer. Later, I would call him love. But that morning, I only watched him from afar, never imagining that by crossing the iron gate of that mansion, I would leave behind everything I believed to be true about life, about death, and about myself. The path leading to the house is narrow and lined with ancient trees whose crowns touch above one's head, forming a natural ceiling that hides the sky. The air there is different, denser, as if it breathes stories. Each step echoes, every falling leaf seems to watch. There was something hypnotic about that place, something that drew me in even as reason whispered for me to leave. And then I saw him. He stood beside the gate, motionless, as if he already knew I was coming. The wind lifted the strands of hair that fell over his face, and for a second I felt the strange sensation of recognizing that gaze, not as something I had seen before, but as something I had once dreamed. There was something ancient in him, something that didn't belong to this time. My heart raced, and in that instant I understood that everything in my life until that moment had been nothing but a prelude to what was about to begin. In his eyes, there was a call, a warning, and still I stepped forward. The mansion rose before me like a monument to forgetting, the tall windows veiled by faded velvet curtains, the heavy doors creaking with the voice of centuries. Everything there smelled of the past, of promises made and left unfulfilled. I felt that every stone carried a name, and that one of those names was mine. Inside, the air was cold and still. Portraits lined the walls, serious faces, eyes that seemed to follow me. The ticking of the pendulum clock marked a time that no longer belonged to the world outside. It was as if the house existed between two moments, suspended, waiting for something. For me, as I walked through the corridors, I realized that nothing there was new, yet everything was cared for with strange devotion. Vases of dried flowers, old books left open on specific pages if someone had placed them that way on purpose. And in every detail, one silent question: who, after all, was that man? They say danger has a scent, and in that house it smelled of damp wood and memories. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I sat by the window watching the garden wrapped in mist. Outside, the world seemed distant, unreal, and then the clock stopped. The sound ceased, and the silence that followed was absolute, the kind of silence that comes before revelations. In that instant, I understood I was no longer a visitor. The house had accepted me. Or imprisoned me. Sometimes, love begins just like that, with a feeling, a shiver, a sound that stops. I didn't know it then, but that would be the first of many signs. In the days that followed that first visit, the house became part of me, like a recurring thought I couldn't silence. Even when I returned to the inn, trying to distract myself with the distant murmurs of the village, something within me remained trapped inside those walls. It was as if the mansion had marked my soul with a memory I had not yet lived. At night, I dreamed of endless corridors, of doors opening into impossible places. Sometimes, the sound of footsteps would wake me though I was alone. Other times, it was only the wind, or perhaps the past itself, whispering. The villagers avoided speaking about the man in the mansion. They said he had inherited the property from an old family, that he was a widower, or perhaps something worse. No one seemed to know for certain. They only repeated stories, each darker than the last. Some swore they had seen him standing in the cemetery, before an unmarked grave, for hours. Others said he was never entirely human, and there were those who claimed he had murdered his own wife, but there was never proof, never a body. And still, no one dared to get close. I should have believed them. But there was something inside me, a curiosity, or perhaps a need, that pushed me in the opposite direction. I began walking to the edge of the estate every day, sometimes just to see it from afar, other times to touch the rusted gate and feel the cold of the iron against my skin. It became a silent ritual, a way to remind myself that I was still alive, and somehow I knew he was watching me, not with hostility, but with quiet attention, like someone recognizing an old pattern repeating itself. One morning, I found the gate slightly open. There was no wind, yet the creak of the hinges sounded like an invitation. I crossed the threshold without thinking, as if an invisible force guided me. The house received me as before, silent, expectant, alive. In the main hall, on a table covered with a linen cloth, there was a cup of tea still warm. Steam rose slowly, drawing shapes in the air. I shouldn't have been there, and yet, nothing within me wanted to leave. Then I felt him again. I didn't see him enter, but I knew he was there. His presence was like a sudden drop in temperature, not a chill from the wind, but something deeper, older. And for the first time, I felt fear, not of the man but of myself, of what I was capable of feeling for a stranger. The days that followed became a quiet rhythm of presences and absences. I didn't know his name, but I felt him in everything. The book moved from its place, the candle lit though I hadn't lit it, the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air after I'd gone. It was as if he lived on the edges of time, watching, unseen. The village continued to whisper its stories, but I no longer listened. There was a strange serenity in living under the same roof as danger. As the weeks passed, fear began to blend with something softer, something far more dangerous. The house, once oppressive, seemed to change its tone as I grew accustomed to it. The shadows no longer felt as threatening, and the silence that once weighed upon me now felt almost comforting. One afternoon, I found a portrait in the main hall, a large painting wrapped in dust and shadows. It depicted a woman with a serene expression, the same eyes I had seen in my dreams. In the lower corner, nearly erased by time, a signature, M.A. My heart raced, not because of the portrait, but because of the strange certainty that the woman was watching me, and that, somehow, she was part of what bound me to that place. That night, the rain fell hard. The sound of the storm echoed through the mansion, and the pendulum clock, silent until then, began to move again, slowly, hesitantly, as if reclaiming a time that had once been broken. When I looked through the window, I saw him outside, standing still under the rain, staring at the house as if he were mourning a tomb. A flash of lightning illuminated his face, and in that instant, I saw no anger in his eyes, only pain. An ancient, profound pain, almost to human. That was the night I understood. He was not the monster they said he was. He was something far more tragic, something the world could never comprehend. In the days that followed, my presence in the house was no longer a secret. He began to appear, not to speak, but simply to exist nearby. A glance, a gesture, a subtle movement. That was all it took to fill the air with a quiet tension, almost spiritual in nature. I watched him as one might watch a wounded animal. And perhaps that was exactly what he was. A being who had learned to survive his own sorrow. With each passing day, the line between fear and devotion grew thinner. I no longer went to the mansion out of curiosity. I went because I needed to, as if there was something that could only be healed in that place. And in that silent surrender, I began to notice things that had once escaped me. Footsteps upstairs, even when we were alone. The sound of a door opening on its own. the portrait of the woman seeming to change expression with the shifting light of day. The house never slept, it merely waited. And one night, when the clock struck midnight and the wind slipped through the cracks in the windows, I saw something that shook me to the core. Our shadows moved in the same rhythm, even when he wasn't there. In that moment, I understood we were already bound. Not by choice, but by destiny. The mansion began to change me. At first it was subtle, a gesture, a memory, a shift in how I perceived the world. Colors seemed deeper yet sadder. Sounds more resonant, as though every noise carried a hidden meaning. It was like living inside a dream that didn't end upon waking. I started spending more time there than in the village. Hours passed differently within those walls. The pendulum clock would sometimes move, sometimes stop for days, as if time itself hesitated to touch that place. I often lost track of the days. Dawn felt distant, and the night, endless, and the man always present, even in his absence. He moved through the house with the ease of someone who knew every shadow. I never saw him enter or leave, but I always found him, somehow, in different places, sometimes in the garden, standing before a broken statue, other times in the library, where the air smelled of dust and solitude. There was a calmness in him that wasn't peace, but resignation, as if he had long ago learned to live with his own curse. Little by little, I began to feel that the house was breathing with us. The walls seemed to listen. The wind, at times, whispered my name. In certain moments, as I passed the portrait of the woman, a sudden chill would wash over me, as though time itself were slipping backward. And then, just for an instant, a delicate, almost imperceptible voice would break the silence, a voice that wasn't mine. At first I thought I was losing my mind, but the more time I spent there, the more natural it all seemed. It was as if I were remembering something forgotten, an echo from another life. Perhaps. One night I found an old book in the library. Its cover was dark leather, the title nearly erased. Memoirs of a Love Time Could Not Erase. I turned the pages and found passages written by hand. In elegant, ancient handwriting, the words spoke of a man and a woman who loved each other against the will of fate, separated by something that should never have happened. The last lines were smudged, as though tears had blurred the ink, and at the end, a signature, M.A., the same initials as the portrait. The letters seemed to pulse under the faint candlelight, and as I read I realized something strange. The story written there was, in essence, my own. Not in detail, but in feeling, in the atmosphere, in the quiet pain between the lines. It was as if the book had been written by someone who already knew what I was destined to live. In the days that followed, the boundary between memory and reality began to dissolve. At times, I saw reflections in mirrors that weren't mine. The outline of an old dress, a masculine shadow behind me, the brief glimmer of a candelabrum that no longer existed. Other times, the sound of footsteps climbed the stairs, even when I was completely alone. And yet, instead of fear, I felt a strange tenderness, an impossible familiarity. The villagers began to look at me with suspicion. They said I was bewitched, that the house was feeding on my soul. Some crossed the street when they saw me coming, but none of that mattered anymore. There was something in that house and in that man that called to me with the strength of an inevitable fate. Love, I discovered, can be a prison disguised as revelation. One afternoon, following the sound of a piano coming from upstairs, I found an abandoned hall covered in white sheets. In the center stood an old piano, layered with dust. The keys were worn, but a soft melody, ghostly, almost fragile, floated through the air. I sat down, hesitant, and pressed a single note. The sound echoed, and somehow, another note answered, as if someone, in another time, was playing with me. Then I felt it again. There was no light, but his presence filled the room. I felt the air move, as though the space between us was breathing. I didn't need to see him, I knew he was there. And for the first time, I didn't run. I closed my eyes, and the music grew stronger, as if several hands were playing at once. A melody woven from memories, promises, and pain. When I opened my eyes, the portrait of the woman, which had once hung in the corridor, was now resting atop the piano, and her eyes, once serene, looked sad, almost alive. The candles flickered, and one of them went out on its own. The silence that followed was so deep I could almost hear my own heartbeat, and within it, something new began to stir. A love that asked for no explanation, only surrender. Even if that surrender would cost me everything. That night, it rained again. The water slid down the windows like ancient tears. I lay down in one of the rooms, and sleep came heavy, dragging me into a strange dream. I dreamed of a spiral staircase, of locked doors, and of a voice calling my name with tenderness and sorrow. When I awoke, there was a rose on my pillow, fresh, damp, as if it had been placed there only moments before. And it was then that I realized he was not only watching me, he was waiting for me. Something was about to be revealed, and deep down, I already knew the love that was being born there was the same one that, in some forgotten time, had ended in tragedy. As the days passed, I realized that time inside the mansion did not obey the same laws that ruled the world outside. Sometimes the sun stood frozen on the horizon, and other times, night fell before I even noticed. The clocks marked impossible hours, and the village's calendar no longer made sense to me. It was as if I had crossed an invisible border, a thin line between what exists and what insists on remaining, even after death. His presence became constant, though still cloaked in silence. There were moments when he appeared in the corridor, his back to me, staring out the window, his face bathed in silver moonlight. I would stand there, motionless, watching, and even without words, I understood everything. Love needs no explanation. It simply is. But there was something in that man that made him almost untouchable, as if to love him were an act of profanation. One morning, I found the main hall open. The curtains had been drawn back, and fresh air flooded the room for the first time since I had arrived. He was there, standing before the woman's portrait, and in that instant, I understood what no one had ever told me: she had been the great love of his life. But love, in that place, was not a refuge, it was a sentence. That woman, I thought, had perhaps died there. Perhaps she had been taken by the same fate that now pulled me toward it. And then, the unthinkable happened. For a brief moment, the portrait seemed to pulse. The painting once still vibrated as if it were breathing, and her face, the same one I had seen in my dreams, turned ever so slightly in my direction. A shiver so intense ran through me that the air fled from my lungs. The man, however, remained motionless, as if he didn't see it, or pretended not to. From that day on, the mansion began to reveal its true nature. Doors moved on their own, candles lit themselves at dusk, and the sound of footsteps echoed through empty rooms. But the most unsettling thing of all was the mirror in the hall, an old mirror framed in iron, reflecting the room with a faint distortion. One night, as I passed before it, I saw something that should not have been there, myself, but in another dress, another face, another time. And behind me, the man, not as he was now, but a younger version of him, more alive, more human. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to understand that the house did not merely keep memories, it repeated them. After that, I began to write. I wanted to record what I saw, what I felt, not to understand, but so I wouldn't forget, because forgetting is the first stage of death. I noted the dates, the sounds, the scents, and soon I noticed a pattern. Everything repeated every 7 days. The rain, the roses, the sound of the piano, everything, as if fate were rewriting itself, trapped in an eternal cycle. One of those nights, I awoke in a fright. The window was open, and the curtain swayed like a sigh. On the windowsill, there was a handprint, fresh damp, as if someone had touched it only seconds before. I looked toward the garden. Nothing, only the wind, and the distant sound of water flowing down the stone steps. But when I closed the window, I saw his reflection in the glass, standing still, watching me. I turned quickly. No one was there. I began to understand what others called danger. It wasn't the man, it was the truth he carried. Something in his presence distorted reality, made things uncertain, fluid, and I, in my surrender, was beginning to fade with him. The village, little by little, forgot me. The world outside the house became distant, almost illusory. I lived there now between the sound of the wind and the uneven rhythm of the clock, and at times, I thought I could hear heartbeats coming from within the walls, as if the mansion itself were alive, feeding on everything we felt. One afternoon, I decided to follow the sound that came from the cellar. It was a low murmur, like a prayer. The staircase spiraled downward, covered in cobwebs and dust. At the bottom, a wooden door sealed with ancient ironwork. I approached, breathing in the scent of damp earth. The wood was cold, almost alive. I pressed my ear against it and heard something. It wasn't wind. It was breathing, the breath of someone on the other side. I stepped back, terrified, but before I could climb the stairs, the flame of my lantern flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed me whole, and for an instant the air grew heavy, almost solid. Then I felt it, a hand touching my shoulder, cold, real. I turned, but no one was there. I ran upstairs, and when I reached the upper floor, I found him standing in the doorway of the hall, motionless, as if he had been waiting for me. His eyes were abyssal, and in them I saw something I would never forget: sorrow and guilt, intertwined so deeply they had become the same thing. That night, I didn't sleep. The wind seemed to whisper my name, and the pendulum clock began to tick again, marking the hours with cruel precision. Each chime sounded like a countdown, and for the first time, I understood something terrible was about to happen. I didn't know if it was the past returning, or the future trying to warn me. But one certainty grew within me. I had not found that man by chance, and the love that was being born between us was only the surface of something far deeper and far more dangerous. From that day on, I began to feel the weight of silence. It wasn't the natural stillness of old houses, but a silence that watched, a silence that breathed with me. With every step through the corridors, I felt the invisible gaze of the house, as though the walls knew all my thoughts, every movement of my heart, and in the midst of it all he seemed always present, even when absent, like a shadow that followed me without ever leaving completely. The love between us grew in a strange, almost secret way. There were no words, no promises, only gestures, presences, subtle touches, and glances that lasted too long. I would see him from afar, and that was enough. The moments we shared seemed to expand, to dissolve into something that belonged to neither of us. There was tenderness, yes, but also an ancient fear, the fear that all of it would come at a price. I began to notice small signs, a mirror that reflected the room as if it were another place, a candle that lit itself without a flame, a portrait that changed color depending on the hour of the day, and a constant feeling that something or someone was watching me with jealousy, a jealousy that wasn't human. In the mornings he would go away. I never knew where to, and at night, he returned wrapped in mist, as though the world outside had been slowly devouring him. His skin was too pale, his eyes burdened with the exhaustion of someone who has lived far longer than he should. Once, I touched his hand and felt the cold, a cold that did not come from the body, but from the soul, a cold that felt older than life itself. He never asked me to stay, but every time I thought of leaving, something stopped me. It was as if the house held me by invisible threads. I dreamed of the gate at the entrance, and every time I tried to open it, it crumbled into dust. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the taste of iron on my tongue. Fear began to mix with devotion, and devotion with madness. One afternoon, I found a locked room at the end of the corridor. The key hung from a rusty nail. Curiosity triumphed over fear. I turned the key slowly, and the creak of the lock echoed like a muffled scream. Inside, the air was different, heavier, older. The walls were covered in portraits, women from different eras, all with the same gaze, and all of them without exception looked familiar. It was as if time had reproduced me in earlier versions of myself. Some smiled, others cried. One looked too alive, her stare so piercing I had to turn away. At the center of the room stood a mirror framed in silver, covered by a dark cloth. Something inside me knew I should not look. But curiosity is the sweetest form of fate. I lifted the cloth. The reflection did not show what I expected. It wasn't me. It was her, the woman from the portrait, and behind her the man, younger, more human, with the same eyes that now held me captive. In the reflection, he touched her shoulder, and she smiled. But the smile didn't last. The glass trembled, cracked, and a sharp sound sliced through the air as if something inside me had broken too. I lowered the cloth, and when I looked again, the mirror was smooth. No reflection, no image, only my pale face and the emptiness behind it. I stumbled out of the room. The house seemed to breathe more heavily, as if it had awakened from a long sleep. And there, in the corridor, he was waiting for me. He looked at me, the way one looks at a secret finally unveiled. There was no surprise in his expression, no anger, only a silent sadness, as if he had always known this moment would come. That night, it rained without end. The sound of the storm merged with the groaning of the windows and the distant echo of voices that seemed to rise from the foundations of the house. I lay down, trying to sleep, but slumber came heavy, filled with images. I dreamed of a garden blanketed in snow. In the center, a body, and all around it, red roses growing from the ground, fed by the blood that seeped between the stones. When I awoke, the floor of my room was wet, not with water, but with something dark and thick. The curtains swayed, though the windows were shut, and on the wall red drops slid downward, as if the house itself were weeping. I should have fled, but the truth is, I no longer could. Love had bound me, and within that love, something had begun to rot. I spent the following days in a kind of trance. He spoke little, or rather, he let me exist between silences, and I learned to understand those silences. They had weight, form, intention. His love was not gentle nor serene. It was the kind of love that consumes, that turns the other into an extension of itself. And I, without realizing it, had already ceased to be only me. One night, as the wind beat against the windows, I heard a familiar sound, the piano. I went down the stairs. The melody was the same one I had heard weeks before, but now it sounded sadder, more desperate. When I reached the hall, he was there, playing, and for a brief instant, I saw the impossible. Over his shoulders, the shadow of a woman. As if two presences occupied the same body, the same form, the same sorrow. And then I understood she had never truly left, and I was becoming the mirror of what she once was. That dawn, something changed inside me. It wasn't fear, nor love, nor madness. It was the certainty that the house wanted something, and that whatever it wanted had to pass through me. I began to feel that every memory, every emotion, every fragment of who I was fed that place. And the more I loved him, the more the mansion seemed to awaken. Something was growing there, something that wasn't life, something ancient, hungry, and inevitable. From that day on, I began to feel as if the air inside the house had weight. Each breath was a memory, each step, a calling. The mirrors once again showed me reflections that were not my own, fragments of another life, another time. I saw the same fog-covered garden, the same ancient staircase, the same woman, but now she moved. She walked through the rooms, passing through walls, always heading toward the same place, the hall where the portrait hung like a shrine. I began to hear voices at dawn, low whispered, almost indistinguishable, as if the house were speaking to itself. Sometimes I could make out single words: promise, guilt, return. Other times, only the constant murmur of someone who has been praying for centuries. And the more I listened, the more familiar those sounds became, as if they were fragments of a language I had forgotten. But my soul still understood. The man him remained the same. He said nothing, but his gestures carried restrained pain. In his eyes, and behind it, a love too impossible to express. I began to realize that his silence was not distance, it was penance, as if his words had been torn from him along with his past. One afternoon, I found a wooden box beneath the floorboards of the room I occupied, small, covered by a thin layer of dust. Inside there were letters, old, yellowed, bound with faded ribbons. When I opened them, the scent of time escaped, that bittersweet smell of aged ink and locked away memories. The letters were addressed to no one, and yet every word felt as if it had been written for me. They spoke of love, of loss, of a promise to meet again. They spoke of a woman named Mariel, and as I read, the name sounded like a distant memory, an echo of something I had lived without knowing. The final lines read, "Not even death will keep me from finding you, not even time will separate me from you. If I must, I will return, even if the price is forgetting." The handwriting was identical to the notes in the old book, and on the last page, a signature, and my body turned to ice. That same night, it rained again. Water streamed down the windows like diluted blood, and the sound of the wind seemed to form words. When I looked into the mirror, I saw my reflection move a second after I did, and it smiled when I hadn't smiled. Fear then mingled with understanding. The house was not merely showing me the past, it was turning me into it. The next morning, the man was no longer in the house. I searched every room, the hall, the library, the portrait chamber, but he was nowhere to be found. The mansion felt colder, emptier, and yet, I could sense he was still there, somewhere within the walls, dissolved into time itself. Then I noticed something new. The woman's portrait had changed. Her serene expression had given way to something darker, as if her face were beginning to fade, to make room for mine. I spent days in confusion. Time lost all meaning. I ate little. I slept poorly. I dreamed of endless corridors, of doors slamming on their own, of voices calling me by a name I did not yet know was mine. And every time I awoke, the same scent lingered in the air, his perfume, mingled with the damp smell of earth and extinguished candles. I began to write again, not in search of answers, but of clarity. I wrote everything I remembered, everything the house showed me, everything it seemed to want me to understand. And I saw a pattern. Every date in the letters matched events I had dreamed of. It was as though the past and the present fed one another, weaving an invisible web, a cycle that refused to break. One of those nights, I heard the piano again, the same melody, slower now, sadder, like a lament. I went down the stairs, my heart burning, and found him there, man sitting at the keys, his eyes fixed on nothing. There was something different about him, paler, distant, as if he were dissolving before my eyes. I sat beside him and for the first time felt the cold of his body passing through the air. He turned his face, and in his eyes I saw the reflection of the portrait, not the current one, but the old one, where the woman smiled. And then I understood what the house had been trying to tell me. I was her, or part of her, or the result of a promise that could not die. The music stopped, and the silence that followed was almost human. He stood, walked to the portrait, and as always, stood before it. But this time, he touched it with both hands, and the glass cracked. A fracture split the woman's face in two. The sound echoed through the house like thunder. At that instant, every candle went out. I froze, and in the dark I heard his voice for the first time, low, almost a whisper. Just one sentence: "You shouldn't have come back." The air vanished from my lungs. I wanted to speak, but no sound came. Before I could move, he turned away and disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, taking the last warmth with him. When dawn came, the portrait was gone. Only the bare wall remained, and on the floor a single wilted rose, still damp with dew or tears. That was when I understood that the love I felt was not new. It was the same love from centuries ago, reborn, relived, repeated like a vow time refused to keep, and for it to exist again, something had to die again. The house was more alive than ever, the air thick with memories, each room breathing its own kind of sorrow. The hall where the portrait had vanished now shimmered with lights that came from no flame. The main corridor smelled of earth and iron, as if something ancient were trying to rise from its foundations. And the piano played on its own every night, as though the house itself remembered the melody. I lost all sense of time. Mornings blended with twilight, and I no longer knew whether what I saw was dream or memory. The woman's face, my face in another time, appeared in mirrors, sometimes weeping, sometimes smiling faintly. She watched me, not with resentment, but as if asking for something I could not yet understand, but felt beating inside me. The man grew distant, more ethereal. He drifted through rooms like a ghost, his gaze fixed on something I could not see. His voice, when it came, was barely a murmur, as though words cost him existence. And the more I loved him, the more he faded, as if love for him were a force of destruction. One misty morning, I followed his steps. He walked toward the forest behind the mansion, a place I had never dared to go. The trees there were dense, ancient, covered in moss and silence. The ground was wet, and the wind whispered stories. I followed him into a clearing where sunlight barely reached. At the center stood a stone mausoleum, covered in ivy and roots. No name, no inscription, only an iron door, sealed and marked with symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. He stopped before it. He stood still for a long time, then spoke, his voice hoarse, almost a lament. "Here is where time stopped." Those were the only words he said before vanishing before my eyes, dissolving like mist into the wind. I was alone. The silence of the forest was deafening. I touched the cold iron door. A wave of vertigo struck me, not fear, but recognition. It wasn't the first time I had stood there. I remembered a dream, or maybe a distant life. The same door, the same feeling of loss, and a promise. A voice saying, "If I die, wait for me here." Then I knew. The man I loved was not the house's master, he was its prisoner, and I was its echo. That night the wind rose, the windows slammed, and the candles lit themselves. The house shuddered. I ran downstairs. The hall was bathed in a red light. The piano played by itself, and shadows danced on the walls. Among them, I saw two figures, he and the woman, dancing in silence, repeating a memory time refused to erase. I moved closer, and the scene froze. The woman turned, and I saw my own face. He looked at me, and horror and recognition mingled in his eyes. He reached out his hand, and when our fingers almost touched, everything disappeared. The music stopped. The house plunged into darkness. I ran to the mirror and saw my reflection flicker, shifting between my face and hers. Two lives overlapping, fighting for the same body. That was when I understood the truth. The mirrors, once windows to the past, now reflected a distorted present, as if deciding which of us, she or I, should remain alive. And I understood, finally, that the love binding me to that man was not just ancient, it was eternal and therefore unbearable. I spent days without leaving my room. Sunlight crossed the windows in thin bands, revealing dust dancing like suspended souls. I daydreamed I saw him, or what was left of him, walking through the corridors, his fingers tracing the walls, searching for something he had lost centuries ago. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I felt him near, so close I could hear his breath blending with mine. But when I opened my eyes, nothing, only wind and the house's steady pulse. One night, I woke suddenly, guided by a force that wasn't mine. The moon poured silver light through the corridor, mist seeped through the doors. I descended the stairs, and there he was, standing before the fireplace, the flames burning blue. His face was pale but serene, no longer spectral, yet not quite human. He seemed a memory made flesh. Above the fire, the portrait had returned, but now, the face was mine. The air tightened around me. The floor tilted beneath my feet. He looked up, his expression a mix of sorrow and relief, and with a voice like an echo, he said, "Now you understand." The words cut through me like glass. I did understand, and I hated understanding. The house, the love, the pain, it was all part of an endless cycle, a vow sealed by souls that never learned to depart. Each century, a new form. Each life, the same end, and I had been chosen or cursed to complete the promise. The fire swelled, and 1,000 voices filled the room, ancient, trembling, speaking in languages I didn't know but understood with my heart. And among them, one phrase rose above the rest: "Free him." The portrait began to burn slowly. The flames moved only across the image, leaving the frame untouched. Inside the fire, I saw Hermia self smiling, as if accepting her fate at last. He fell to his knees, his tears turning to ashes as they touched the ground. I approached him without fear, cupped his face in my hands, and for the first time, he wasn't cold. I felt warmth, a heartbeat, life, but that warmth wasn't human. It was the warmth of the end. "Is this how it ends?" I thought. He answered with his eyes. "This is how it begins." The flames roared, the house trembled, and the walls collapsed into light. The air vibrated like a living thing. I understood then to free him was not to escape fate, but to accept it. Some loves do not live in time. They exist in the space between one life and another, and the end is not death, it is forgetting. I laid a rose upon the tombstone. The iron beneath my fingers grew warm. The light swallowed everything, and all that remained was the sound of a single heartbeat. Hours. One. Then, silence. When I awoke, I was lying on the crypt floor. The light was gone, the tombs were empty. Only 2 intertwined shadows remained on the wall, and the wind carried away the last notes of the piano. I climbed the stairs. Sunlight flooded the hall. For the first time, the house felt truly alive, or truly at peace. I stepped outside. The air was clear. The gate stood open, and behind me, the mansion seemed to exhale, its purpose fulfilled. As I walked down the road, I closed my eyes. Let the wind carry the memory, and kept walking. But sometimes, when night falls and silence thickens, I still hear the piano. Soft, distant, like an echo from another life. And within its sound a promise that never dies. Not even death will keep me from loving you. Days passed. The village felt brighter, as if an ancient shadow had lifted with the mansion's fall. Yet something within me remained suspended. The body moving, the soul elsewhere. I built a small house by the lake. I wrote, not to remember, but to remember to forget. Words became my refuge, a new home built upon the ruins of the old. In the following days, the signs returned. The scent of roses in the morning, the ticking of a clock that did not exist, a shadow moving when the light dimmed. Fresh, red, still dewy. I knew love had not ended. It had only changed form. Love never disappears, it becomes shadow, wind. I woke to footsteps in the hall. And through it, the same body, the same gaze, but freed of sorrow. He smiled. He lifted his hand. I stepped forward, but he shook his head gently now. Then he pointed to the horizon. Through the mist, I saw it, the mansion, rebuilt, alive, waiting. When I looked again, he was gone. But the sound of the piano returned, faint, distant. The clock struck midnight. Its chime pulsed like the heart of a sleeping world, and I heard the whisper, "Come home." So I went, and when I opened the door, the house was new, bright, breathing, alive, waiting. And I understood the story was not about endings, it was about return. About the echo that love leaves behind when time itself runs out. Because in the end, all we are is what we love. And love, even when it wears the face of danger, is the only thing worth existing for. And when night falls and the world grows quiet, I hear one last note from the piano. Soft, distant. I close my eyes and feel the touch of his hand. No pain, no loss. Only the gentle reunion of two souls that can finally rest. And the silence that follows is love.